You're listening to EFT Radio Online, where we explore meridian tapping techniques for self-help and peak performance. By listening to this audio, you agree to the disclaimer located at EFTradioonline.com/disclaimer. If you'd like to get the schedule of all the upcoming EFT radio shows and access to archive shows, please visit us at EFTradioonline.com, where you can subscribe to our free newsletter.
Welcome to EFT for your inner child and soul with best-selling author Cathryn Taylor. Known as the mother of inner child work, Cathryn is dedicated to teaching you her innovative EFT technique called interactive tapping. Interactive tapping combines Cathryn's 26 years of experience guiding you in the discovery of your inner child with EFT sequences. This combination empowers you to take responsibility for your own healing. Cathryn is a licensed marriage and family therapist and addictions counselor and is certified by EFT master Lindsay Kenny. Tune in every other week as Cathryn teaches you how to tap your way through addictions to abundance, through fear to faith, betrayal to trust. And now I'm proud to introduce you to the mother of inner child work, Cathryn Taylor.
Greetings and welcome. Welcome to this month's broadcast of my 2016 Free Conscious Living series. And this year, I am focusing on presenting to you my newly developed 4-stage, 12-step spiritual recovery program. Now, this program is based on the 12 traditional steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And what I have realized is that in the last 80 years since that recovery movement has been around, there literally has been an evolution of these stages as they have been applied not only to alcoholism or drug addiction, but to the multiple addictions in which many of us are engaged. So my goal and what I'm trying to do, not only in this broadcast, but throughout this year, is really show you how truly universal the 12 steps are, how they can be applied to any excessive behavior that is serving to disconnect you from your God as you understand him, her, or it. I want to show you how, due to the global post-traumatic stress that I've talked about in previous broadcasts, how that is really impacting almost every one of us. And it has become what Dr. Heidi Hanna calls stressaholism, that many of us are suffering from it. There's a reason for that I go into in depth in the first broadcast, and that what that has resulted in is that many of us are in need of a spiritual program, something to bring us back to that higher source and to that authentic self. And what I'm proposing is that one of the most universal, user-friendly, and available spiritual programs out there is the 12 steps. Now, what I think is really exciting as I'm researching all of this is that this is embedded in the work of Carl Jung, who was the first medical person, he was probably the first person to say that what the alcoholic was suffering from was a spiritual disease. And the short version of this story is that a man who was from a very affluent family back east was sent to Carl Jung to work with him to try to help him get sober. And I believe he worked with him for like over a year. And then he completed treatment, and the man made it as far as Paris. I think they were somewhere else in Europe, Germany, Vienna, someplace. But he didn't make it very far before he relapsed. He came back and said to Jung, we need to do something else. And that's when Carl Jung said, there is no human power that's going to be able to help you with this. This is of a spiritual nature. And that word got back to Bill W., because this man then went back to the States. He found the Oxford group, which is a spiritual program that he started building on, and it started keeping him sober. Somehow he ran into a man named Ebby, who then connected with Bill W., and Bill W. started looking at the Oxford group. He felt like their steps were too rigid for the alcoholic, that it would result in kind of a rebellion, which he was probably right. And so he modified them. But I think what's really magical here is that one of the leading psychiatrists of the time, and leading psychiatrists, I think, of the entire world, is Jung. And he was the first one that said, this is of a spiritual nature. And that has been documented and built on over and over and over again. This was documented in one of the many letters that was exchanged between Jung and Bill W. And one of the things he said is that he had observed that the alcoholic's thirst for alcohol is, quote, the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language, the union with God, end of quote. So there you have it. In a more informative video, Dr. Jeffrey Sandenover, he's a gerontologist specializing in addiction, and he studied this. And he began to examine the underlying psychological and spiritual dimensions of alcoholism and addiction, more from that Jungian perspective. And he observed, quote, what people experience in addictive behavior is something which, in and of itself, is normal. There is within every human, or so it would seem, a need for the divine. That is to say, the craving is normal, the craving for certain kinds of elation, for a certain sense of specialness, for heroism, for cessation of pain. And underlying all of those, really, ultimately, and most powerfully, is the seeking of a sense of meaningness. Now, author Robert Johnson draws on Jung's archetypes and ancient mythology as fables for understanding and explaining the psychological reality of addiction. If we don't get our ecstasy, this is really interesting, if we don't get our ecstasy, which is an archetypal quality, legitimately, it will, so to speak, pop up somewhere in its symptomatic, that is, its compulsive form, which accounts for much of the chaos of the culture now. So there we have it. The compulsion and the obsession of the alcoholic or the addict centers in the mind, or so it seems, just as it's been stated in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous ever since that was written. Now, there has been a lot of support since those early years in substantiating this. And one of the best ways that this is evidenced is how many times the 12 steps have been applied to the multiple addictions that as a society, as a planet, we have come to engage in. And again, I talked a lot about that in the previous broadcasts, where I talked about the father of addiction, which to me is stressaholism, because it's fueled by adrenaline. And I think the father of addiction, I think stress, is at the bottom of every acting out excessive behavior that we engage in. The mother of addictions I call the codependency, because it's fueled by the oxytocin. It's fueled by that need to nurture and that desire to be nurtured. And then sandwiched between the mother and father of addictions, it's all of those offspring. The gambling, the sex addiction, and most recently, the addictions to media, to Facebooking, all of those. And each one of these addictions are serving to not only sever us from our maker, but they're also filling the void that we feel in response to that disconnection. So again, what I really want to address this year with you is the universality of the 12 steps, the vast need for some spiritual program due to the stress that most of the planet is experiencing. And you've heard me talk about this. It's even being stated that as a planet, we're suffering from global post-traumatic stress. So I strongly recommend, if you're just tuning in at this point, that you go back to that first broadcast and step 1 and step 2 because I give a little bit more of the history. What's exciting for me with developing this program is each month I get a little bit more of the history, and so that is interwoven. In the ultimate book that I am writing about this, it will be structured a little differently, but you're getting it as I'm getting it. And each month, as I said, I'm focusing on a different step, and I begin by giving you a review of what the whole program is, just in case you're tuning in for the first time. Then I give you an introduction or an overview of the step that we're targeting. But what's unique about this is that I'm bringing the tapping into each of the 4 stages. So I want to talk about the 4 stages generally, and then we'll get into the step that I'm focusing on this month, which is step 3. All right, so what I have discovered in my work, and I've really been involved in the field since 1985, and what I have seen is that there has been an evolution, and that evolution has now been pictured in each of these different stages. So the first stage of recovery, obviously, is intervention, and that stage was inspired by the original first 100 alcoholics that used the principles that Bill W. laid down for them. And actually, that's incorrect. He didn't lay them down for them. The first 100 actually had an active part. He was the recorder of it. And he used a lot of the words. But in the big book, you'll notice that they continue to use the word we. And they really wanted to impress that it wasn't one person's belief or one person's idea or one person's doing. It was the group itself, and they were agreeing on these principles. And the cornerstone of 12 steps is not only that you recognize that you're powerless over whatever behavior it is that you're addressing, and that you need to surrender that attempt to be powerful to a power that's greater than you, even if it's the group. And that once you make a decision to do that, which is step 3, which we're talking about today, you're really committing to the next 6 steps, which is the plan of action. That plan of action, as you'll see a little bit today, but throughout this year, that plan of action is really what enables us, once we get out of our way of letting God back into our lives. That's the formula for continuing to keep ourselves out of the way. And the 6 steps are the active way of getting current. And then steps 10, 11, and 12 keep us current with staying on top of things of where we might sabotage ourselves. 11 is continued spiritual practice, and 12 is service. So the 12 steps themselves are really divided or categorized into basically 3 sections. What we have dealt with and will complete today is that first section of steps 1, 2, and 3. And step 1 is obviously admitting that you're powerless. That's the first time that you are moving beyond your ego need to control. And you're recognizing that what you're doing is not working. You hit your bottom in whatever way that speaks to you. Step 2 is when you come to believe that the problem that you've addressed in step 1 can be solved by a power outside of yourself. And that power for many, as we've talked about last month, is sometimes the group, is sometimes your sponsor, sometimes the nature. It doesn't have to be this omnipotent being, because so many people have so many mixed feelings about the God as it was described in religion, that they're really looking for a spiritual definition. And in step 2, you really get to make that decision. And then in step 3, you're really encouraged to define that power greater than self any way that makes sense to you. So those are the first 3 steps. Then step 3 really is making a commitment to work the next 6 steps. And steps 4 through 9 is the plan of action. And then the last The third segment is what I just talked about a few minutes ago. Step 10, 11, and 12. Those are the steps that you continue to do. 10 is basically a daily version of 4 through 9. You're just, once you've cleaned all of it out, then you do it one day at a time. You stay current with yourself. You make amends immediately if you have violated some boundary of yourself or some value or had some infraction with somebody else. You take care of it. You clean it up. And then 11 is when you continue to practice your own spiritual readings and your protocols that keep you connected. And then 12 is being of service. So the 12 steps are basically categorized in that way. We're completing that first segment of 1, recognizing that there's a problem, 2, identifying what the solution is, which is coming to believe in a power greater than self, and 3, making a decision to put into a plan of action that solution. So getting out of your own way and getting God back into your life. Now, one of the things that I'm trying to bring to you as we have been around recovery for a while is that getting God back into our lives, it morphs into different tasks as we progress in our recovery. So in that first stage of recovery, we're really turning to a power outside of ourselves. We're shifting our dependency from whatever our excessive behavior is or our physiological addiction is. We're really shifting that dependency over to the group or to the structure of the 12 steps, to the meetings, to something outside of ourselves. And we can be pretty clumsy about it at first. We're not going to have a lot of experience of step 3, which we're talking about today, where you actually turn it over. That first step is just simply to intervene in the behavior. And that can take a while to do. Although you're working the steps, it's progress, not perfection. And so you are getting better and better at learning how to cope with life non-addictively as you shift that dependency on your old excessive behavior that continued to discharge that stress, and you get that need met now through the group or the structure or working the 12 steps, the structure of the meetings. And so that's what step 1 or stage 1 is all about. And the relationship that you're dealing with in stage 1 is really giving birth to what I call the recovering self. And the recovering self is gaining momentum and basically morphs into what I call the illuminated adult self. But the recovering self is that part of you that develops the support system and the structure to be able to say no to the addict within. And as you get better and better at that, your life currently, day to day, starts working. So when you are coping with the events of your day-to-day life without acting out, when you've established a fairly viable recovery program and you've integrated that into your life, then you just naturally progress into stage 2. Now, stage 2 is healing the past. Stage 2 evolved really in this 80 years that the recovery movement has been around. It really evolved in the early 80s, mid-80s, with the birth of the Adult Children of Alcoholics program, which was an outgrowth of marriage and family therapy, which started basically with Virginia Satir in California. And that was all part of the human potential movement. So part of the history and the evolution of this is how the human potential movement began to merge with the recovery movement. And out of that came the Adult Children of Alcoholics movement, which was the bedrock for the inner child movement, which again is where my contribution came in. That's what I kind of live, breathe, and eat, is the inner child working with the past. And as many of you know, that inner child past has taken me way into not only the past of this lifetime, but the fragments of our soul. But that's more 4th stage. In 2nd stage, we start dealing with the patterns of behavior that have created all that stress. and resulted in our acting out. So with addiction, there's the physiological component where we have an allergy to anything that we're ingesting. But there's also the biochemical component, which is physiological, and that happens even in the process addictions or in the multimedia addictions. There is that adrenaline rush and the neurotransmitted hormones that happen when we experience stress and we go into that fight or flight response. We get addicted to that. Like I talked about before, Candace Pert was the first one that recognized that the more stress we feel, we develop the receptor sites where we crave that kind of adrenaline. And that's what Robert Johnson was talking about, is that natural need for elation, for connection. And we're striving for that. And what we filled it with is our addictions. So stage 2 is when we really go back, and the relationship we're dealing with is the relationship with that fragile self within us, that inner child. And what's different between what we experienced as a child and what we experienced or have to offer in this point in our recovery and in our journey is that we are able to be the parent that that child needed. And so the response becomes more of a vertical relationship between the illuminated adult self, who's very connected to a power greater than self, and is able, with that compassion that we have developed or experienced with being accepted in the group and coming into relationship with that higher power, we now are able to transmit that in a more loving way to our child within. And whatever way that we're successful or non-successful with that, that's where our work is. Many of us find that we treat our inner child the same way we were treated. And so part of that stage 2 is developing a nurturing parent, a nurturing inner male and female. So that can take anywhere from 3 to 5 years, and usually people have at least a good 2 years in recovery before that happens. That continues until you morph into more of an integrated state, and then that moves into stage 3. Stage 3 is more about updating your value system and beginning to live your life from a more spiritual stance. Well, what that involves is bringing harmony to that inner relationship between what I call your human self and your spiritual self, or your human self and your higher self. So I differentiate between the higher self and the higher power. The higher self is that most evolved, expanded part of you, where you can really begin to look through the eyes of that spiritual value system, and you begin making choices accordingly, which is very powerful. That's called taking the high road. But it's not in a pathetic way. It's really in an empowered way. It's a compassionate way where you're beginning to be able to tune into what Jung called the collective consciousness, unconscious. That essence that connects us to others in a very broad way. And so we begin to track that, and we begin to not feel so alone. We begin to feel a sense of our spiritual support system. Many people then begin to have experiences with their guardian angels and with guides and with other beings in other dimensions. And of course, then that opens the door to stage 4, which is really dealing with the multidimensionality, not only of our addictions, but of our existence. We begin to entertain the idea that our excessive behaviors and our addictions perhaps have a sole purpose, and that we came in using that addictive behavior as a way to get us in touch with what that spiritual task is. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into how step 3 really emerges in each of these stages. The other aspect of stage 4 is the new brain science. And that is relatively new, just since the end of the last century did it become apparent that we literally can change the way our brain operates. It's called neuroplasticity. And we can impact the neural pathways and alter them so that we begin to default to a more positive way of being than a survival way of being. And that feeds into the DNA reprogramming and the ability to literally reconfigure the electromagnetic field that exists around us. Well, that takes us into a whole different level of recovery, a whole different perspective of our addictions. And as you will see, or you've already heard, one of the benefits of this program is to really help you realize that each of us has a series of addictions. We're multi-addicted. And so literally, you can be in one of the stages of addiction for one excessive behavior and in another one for another. So you can have your primary addiction. Let's say you came into recovery because of alcoholism, and you're in recovery and you're working the steps, and all of a sudden you've done some of your stage 2 work and you realize, boy, now instead of, I'm not using alcohol anymore, but now I'm using food. Or now my codependency has kicked in. Or now I have started shopping instead of drinking. So you can begin your recovery for shopping back at stage 1, but you're processing your alcoholism from stage 3. So by introducing you to these 4 stages that have evolved, you're going to be able to pinpoint, and by using the tapping that I offer at the end of each of these broadcasts, I take you through the tapping sequence for stage 1, and then stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4 of that respective step, so that no matter where you're at, each aspect of you is going to get a little of attention. All right, so what exactly is step 3? Step 3 reads like this. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand him, her, or it. All right, now let's take this apart a little bit more. First of all, what does made a decision even mean? Well, according to the 12 steps and 12 traditions, it really involves finding the key to opening the door, and once ajar, the rest will follow. You can see the door, but you have to have the key to open it. And what they say is the key is a willingness to open it, and then you take the action. The key is willingness. Once there's willingness, action can follow. But it can't follow until you're willing to really give it up. Well, what are you giving up? Turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. Well, what our will is our attachment. It's our ego. It's our need to control. It's our belief that we are in charge. It's that desire to be the director and the actor in our own play, to be the whole enchilada. It's that belief of being the know-it-all. I can do it myself. Now, some of that was dislodged when you admitted your own powerlessness and when you began to believe that a power outside of self could really restore you to sanity. But step 3 is when you cross that threshold. But it's very difficult to do. So what does it really look like? You have to have the key of willingness, and then you have to take the action. You have to actually walk through that door, and this is one of those steps that nobody else can take for you. Nobody else can make that decision for you. But it's very difficult to know what that means. Well, what it looks like when you first come into the program is it's simply making a decision to listen to those in the groups talk about the way that they dealt with their problem. So it's getting out of your own way and recognizing that those that have traveled before you may have something to offer you. So that's one way you look at it. You also experience step 3 just by participating in the structure of the program itself, just by being willing to go to the groups. You've heard the saying, 90 meetings and 90 days. Now, it's not the meetings that are going to keep you sober, but the structure, filling that space with groups and hearing how other people are doing it. That's a willingness to hear another plan of action because yours has not worked. So it's going outside of self. It's working with a sponsor and allowing that sponsor to give you direction. In a food program, it is adhering to a food plan and recognizing that your food plan didn't work, and maybe the nutritionist gave you a food plan, or the program that you went to suggested that you just might do better with your food plan if you quit eating wheat and sugar and just gave your body a rest. And your willingness to try that, your willingness to let that override what your instinct is. That is what step 3 looks like. And it's fluid, and you continue to expand on that willingness and that allowing. Now, the last part of this step is, as we understand him, her, or it. This is what separates this spiritual practice from any other spiritual program on the planet, is it's non-dogmatic. And that's why it has found its way into 170 out of 196 countries and has been translated into so many languages and is so universal, is because it doesn't tell you what you have to believe in. It just encourages you and suggests that you have to believe in something outside of yourself. And that you get to define. And that continually gets redefined. And you'll see that when I apply step 3 to each of the stages. And so what I have really noticed about the first 3 steps is that they're very similar to how I view the 5 stages of grief. It's my perception that we are always in one of those 5 stages of grief. We're either feeling anxious and worrying about being separated from something or experiencing a loss. We're trying to bargain with that loss. We're feeling angry about that loss. We're feeling despair, or we're in a state of acceptance and peace. Those are the 5 stages of grief. Well, the first 3 steps are dealing with the powerlessness, which is the problem, at recognizing the solution, which is coming to believe, and 3, making a decision to let that solution come into your life. We are perpetually reliving those and redesigning that, and it augments and becomes more and more powerful. And we are able to see how many places we're really trying to take control. Now, I think one important point to make about this is I hear a lot of people use step 3 as a way to not take responsibility for their lives. Well, I'm just going to turn it over. And they don't take the action that's necessary. Well, I'm looking for a job, but I'm just going to turn it over, and I know that God will bring one to me. Well, that's not going to happen. What we're letting go of is the outcome. But we still have to do the legwork. It's the attachment to the outcome that puts us back into a position of trying to control again, and that's what gets us into trouble. So what we're really doing is getting out of our own way. And in the big book, it talks about how actually taking this step, there's a prayer that I'm going to read to you in a minute, and when we do the tapping, we'll tap to it. But it suggested, first of all, that you take this prayer in the presence of someone else. And then many people use this prayer on a daily basis. And this prayer is, quote, God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love and the way of life. May I do thy will always. So there you have it. That's a way to take step 3 on an ongoing basis. And again, I want to underline, we're continually doing this. We're continually vying for control, recognizing we are powerless, admitting this fact, returning to our knowingness and belief that the universal force or higher power, or God as you define him, her, or it, will guide you back to sanity, and then making a decision to follow that lead. It's like allowing your intuition or your higher power to be your GPS. And you gradually trust that more and more. So again, step 3 is really making a decision to commit, to embark on a plan of action outlined in the following 6 steps that will be the gateway to keeping that door open. So you're willing to follow that structure. You're willing to open that door. You're willing to go to the groups. You're willing to listen to others. And the way this happens really morphs according to which stage of recovery you're in. And it continues to recycle based on the way that you try to take control back. Now, I recently had an experience with this because since I had the problem with my knee, I think I've shared in other broadcasts, I found that I was starting to really compulsively eat because running for 40 years had really managed that for me. But I just started grazing, and all of a sudden it was just like I was just obsessed with what the next bite was. So I went to this program, and it was a wonderful 5-day program in Wayzata, Minnesota, called CORE, C-O-R. And I just submerged myself in this spiritual environment for 5 days that got me back on track. One of the things that I committed to was a food plan. Well, I was doing the food plan. It was successful. I got back on track. The obsession was gone. And, maybe about the 8th or 9th month, I started getting a little more complacent. And I didn't start messing with what was on my sheet, but I started messing with the order in which it was eaten. So in other words, part of my quote-unquote snack was a certain amount of raspberries. Well, what I found myself doing is to take a break, I'd go and I'd get a couple raspberries. Now, I continued to eat the amount that was allowed, but I wasn't staying with the structure. And what began to happen is I was beginning to use those raspberries like 30 years ago I used a cigarette. It became my pause. I'd be at the computer and I'd get stuck with something. And instead of praying or meditating or pausing and just connecting, I'd jump out of my seat and go grab a couple raspberries. Well, over a couple weeks, those raspberries then opened the door to my saboteur to begin to negotiate the volume that I was eating. I never did cross that line where I actually ate my trigger foods, but I certainly ate more than was good for me. And I realized that that's where I stepped over that line. It happened gradually. I didn't wake up one day and just recognize or say to myself, I'm going to take control again. It just crept in, and all of a sudden, I was back into the obsession. I wasn't into the compulsive behavior, but I was into obsessing about those next couple berries. And that's the way it happens. So I really learned, again, how important it is, how powerless I am over putting those couple raspberries in my mouth. Now that sounds, to somebody that doesn't even track this, it sounds so insignificant, but it opened the door. Just like we have to open the door with our willingness, we open our door to the saboteur, and pretty soon it gains more and more ground. So step 3 is all about making a decision. And one of the most useful tools in step 3 is the serenity prayer. So let's look at that for a minute. So the serenity prayer is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, that is really indicative of where we do give up the attachment, but we're willing to take the action where necessary. So at some point, we need to discern, Is this something I'm trying to control? Is there anything that I can do in this situation? Any action I have to take? If I am obsessing about an interaction I had with someone, then this is where the later steps come into action. Is there a step I need to take? Do I need to make an amends? I can't control the outcome of the amends, but I can sure take the action to clean that up. So that would be that second part of the serenity prayer, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. The wisdom is really understanding that all I can do is take care of my side of the fence. So the serenity prayer is used at the end of a lot of meetings. People use it a lot when they're just kind of entrenched in that reactivity, in their trigger, in their craving. I have an even shorter version that I use, and I use it with tapping. And that shorter version is simply, God's love resolves the situation here and now. And while I'm tapping on the endpoints, I say that over and over and over. I say it once, and then I move to the next point. God's love resolves the situation here and now. Sometimes I use the universe. Sometimes I say God's love resolves this stress now. God's love resolves the situation. It's like, but it's short, it's quick, and I can use it, and I don't bother with an even though or a setup. I just tap until I get out of that reactivity. So that's another viable way of actually taking step 3.
You are listening to EFT for Your Inner Child on EFT Radio Online with best-selling author and licensed practitioner Cathryn Taylor.
Okay, so now let's look at how step 3 interfaces with each of these evolutionary, progressive stages of recovery. Well, we've talked a lot about stage 1. Stage 1 is the intervention. Stage 1 is when you make the willingness or have the willingness to turn that will over to a higher power and to begin to embark on the 6 steps of the plan of action. It's when you're willing to listen to others. And so we've talked a lot about that, and we've talked a lot about how you define God. When that emerges or unfolds into stage 2 is when you begin to look at the decisions that you need to make in terms of acknowledging that a lot of your maladaptive behavior really came from what you experienced in childhood. And you make a decision to embark on a journey of healing that child within. You give credence to the belief systems, even though it was the fragile, false self, even though the beliefs of the inner child were based on faulty information, and you've carried that faulty information into adulthood. The only way that that is going to be rectified is for someone within you to finally step up and meet that inner self's needs. And until those needs are met, they keep getting projected out into your life and onto others. One of the biggest mistakes that I see people make with their inner child work is they try to get their inner child to do what they were unable to do at that age. They try to evolve them so that the inner child can set the limit. Well, the inner child was too little. If the inner child had been able to do that at that time, he or she would have. So step 3 is having the willingness to embrace with great compassion those frightened parts of you that sometimes act out in really ugly ways, that sometimes express your jealousy or your insecurity or all those feelings that we hate to experience, acknowledge, even though we're always experiencing them. But if we do not go in and begin to work those out, then they're going to, at the very best, keep us unhappy, and at the very worst, result in relapse. So step 3 is really developing the willingness and making a decision to cross that threshold between present time and the experiences of your child within. But the most important part of this is to be separate. Now again, a lot of people do not understand that in order to heal the inner child, you have to have this dyad. This is the relationship in stage 2. It's the relationship between the illuminated adult self, which has emerged and evolved from the recovering self, because the recovering self in stage 1 has learned how to cope with life. You now know how to deal with life in ways that you didn't as a child. So it's pairing this new wisdom of your evolved, illuminated adult self with the inner child. And slowly, the inner child builds trust. And as the adult makes a decision to heal with great compassion that fragile self, in turn, the fragile self repeatedly and progressively makes a decision to trust the adult self. So both sides are making a decision to turn the will, the ego, the false ways of coping, the animosity that exists between the adult self and the inner child. You're making a decision on both sides to take that step and to surrender that, to make the decision to turn that ego over, that will over, to a higher experience. The inner child, the higher self for the inner child, is the adult self. You are your inner child's higher self. And the adult self is the go-between. Now, when we're dealing with vibrational frequencies, because the fragile self is vibrating in a denser emotional state, the inner child cannot always make contact with the higher self, let alone the higher power. It's too intensified. And there's too much shame that emerges. But the compassionate adult self, once it develops a relationship with the inner child, can be that go-between. So step 3 is really about that willingness to embark on that journey and really give the inner child the attention and the acknowledgement that he or she deserves. Now, it's important to remember that part of this program is really dealing with that global addiction to stress and our acting out in these new addictions with the Facebooking and the texting and all of those ways that we're becoming more and more isolated. Well, stage 2 is where we really begin to deal with the roots of that. In step 1, we were really dealing with the withdrawal from that activity and getting right with ourselves, learning how to cope. But in this stage, we're dealing with the root of that stress. We're dealing with really going in and, like a roto-rooter, cleaning it up so that we can get back into a state of peace. Once we deal with those old reactive triggers, then we no longer are responding to our life from that fight or flight response, because there's that internal mechanism that's working, that is fueled by the compassion that's being disseminated from higher power, higher source, through the higher self, to the adult self, to the inner child. So there is this continuum of compassion and love, and that is the elixir that ultimately heals. So that's stage 2. Stage 3 is when we emerge more into this reciprocal relationship between our human self, who's a little bit more integrated now because of stage 2 work, and pairing that with that more illuminated vibrational self that we're now willing to make a decision to expand into. So the decision part in stage 3 is really having the willingness to look at life through a different perspective, to recognize that you can get triggered and you don't have to go there. You don't have to respond. You don't have to care what other people think, because your true connection is really vertical. You've come home to yourself. You're allowing that power greater than self to be your GPS, not the impressions of others. So you've moved from being externally referencing to being internally referencing with that support of the higher self. Now you've got the support of the fellowship, so it's not like you're isolated, but you've come home to a higher vibrational frequency of self. And when you get to that place, you have more compassion for yourself, you have more compassion for others, but primarily you are now living what I call that holy trilogy. It's like the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Well, the internal manifestation of that is the parent, child, and higher power. We are embodying that essence of God. In the Blue Book, it talks about how every man has that spark of the divinity within him. Well, stage 3 is when we allow that spark to really shine within us, and we begin to live our life accordingly. Now, one of the ways that I picture this, one of the decisions we make, is to come into union between the higher self and the human self. And the minister of that marriage, the officiant of that marriage, is the higher power. So again, here's that trilogy. But the most important thing that I want you to remember, the most important word I want you to associate with stage 3 is accountability. And with respect to step 3, you are making a decision to be accountable for the energy that you put out there, recognizing that what you put out comes back to you. And you shift from being ego-driven to spirit-infused. Now that's really, really the underpinning of stage 3, is that shift. And so you are allowing your higher self and your higher power to be the board of directors of your life and to direct you, and you're showing up. And that's very powerful. Now, when you progress or evolve into stage 4, you're looking at your whole addiction from the multidimensional perspective. So you're making a decision to see the bigger picture as it exists and pertains to your soul lineage. In other words, you're asking questions like, in the infinite wisdom of my soul, what is it that you wanted me to learn from this opportunity of going down that dark path? I talked about Bill Wilson. I still believe that Bill Wilson is an ascended master who agreed to go down a very, very rocky road and to find his way back. Now, because of personal choice, he could have never shown up for that, but I think that it was part of his soul journey to actually do that and then to have the spiritual awakening that he did. I think that's true of each and every one of us. And by the time we are making our decisions in stage 4, we are looking at things from that angle. We are allowing ourselves to see the bigger picture, not only of our own path of recovery, but of our participation in the recovery movement in itself, how we are contributing to the healing of the planet. And every time we look at the bigger picture, that occurs. Every time we are willing to change the neural pathways in our brain, we are contributing to what Jung called the collective unconscious. We are impacting that. We are contributing to the mandala of healing. That's stage 4 recovery. We're seeing it as so much bigger than just our experience. And because of that, the isolation and the separateness and the duality begins to dissolve. And with that dissolution comes our ability to really use our intuition and our connection and our inner knowingness and our ability to track the multi-dimensional pieces of ourselves. And that includes the multi-dimensional pieces of our addictions. So there's room for us to track that one part of us is dealing with the food addiction while another part of us is expanding and evolving in the 4th stage with respect to our primary addiction. While another one is just kind of spiraling around and recognizing Yes, I am using Facebook excessively. Some people even come to realize that they're using meetings excessively, that they're actually blocking their spiritual expansion because they're socializing so much at the groups or in the groups that they're not allowing those pauses in their life for spirit to really talk to them. So they're experiencing the fellowship, but they're not experiencing the fullness of what the steps have to offer because they're getting sidetracked in an addiction to the socializing, just like we get addicted to the Facebooking. We want to know what everybody's doing. Well, we're so involved vertically with that we're not being, we're not allowing. And so stage 4 is making a decision to find those quiet moments and to use that prayer from a completely different angle. So now listen to this prayer from 4th stage expansion. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help. Of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life, may I do thy will always. Boy, now that feels really different, doesn't it? When you're talking from that expanded place and you recognize that vibrationally you are really making yourself available to be a conduit for the love of God. So yes, it's a power greater than self, but it's now a power that you can resonate with and be empowered because you've gotten your ego out of the way and you're willing to be an agent for the universal energy. You are an example of that divinity. And continuing to work those steps, to continue to hold yourself accountable, to continue to do your 10th step on a daily basis, to have the courage to clean things up right away. When you act in a human way that you don't feel good about, you clean it up. I guess it was about 10 years ago. It was when I was traveling around the country in my RV. And I was actually with my mom, because I remember we stopped at this Holiday Inn, and I took my RV and I went under, the little area where you would actually register, and I didn't realize it, but the air conditioner on my RV scraped a line in the stucco. So I didn't even realize this. So we had done that, and we were parked a little bit over in the parking lot because we were trying to decide what to do. And the manager came out to confront me on it. And I remember I got real indignant with him and just got really sassy with him, and just because I felt embarrassed, and I got defensive with him. And I didn't like the way I responded. And so it just kind of ended in this standoff. Well, then Mom and I got back on the freeway, and I got to the next exit, and I pulled off, and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, I just have to call him back. That wasn't right of me to lay into him like that. I at least need to make him an apology and give him my contact information and let him know how he can get a hold of me and take care of it. And that was one of my first examples of recognizing that it was my own integrity that I was taking care of. And so it's showing up that way. All right, so enough talk. Let's get into the tapping. So let's begin the tapping. Now, I have to say on every broadcast that if this is the first time that you're tapping with me, I need to remind you that, first of all, you're doing this according to your own will, so you have to be responsible for yourself. If you've never tapped before, then go to my website. Just listen to these words, but don't get confused with trying to tap. Just go through it as a meditation, and then take time to go to my website to look at the tab that says Interactive Tapping Explained. Watch Gary Craig's video that gives you a really nice overview on tapping first, and then watch mine, and you're going to learn where the tapping points are and get familiar with it. For those who are veterans of tapping, I want to remind you to be sure and have water available. We're dealing with the electrical circuitry of your body, so you need to be well hydrated. I will not be calling out the individual points when we get to the reminder phrases, but we will start on the karate to state the setup. The setup is designed to say what we're experiencing, where we want to go, and how we're going to get there. Okay, so let's come to the karate chop, and we're going to do the tapping for step 3 as it emerges in step 1. Tapping on the karate, repeat after me. Even though I slip into playing God and continue to try to control everything around me and to run the show, part of me is really ready to surrender. I am willing to make a conscious choice to turn my will, my ego, my need to control over to my higher power, to God as I understand Him or it. So even though I keep getting in my own way and I have a hard time developing the willingness to surrender, I know that willingness is the key. And I'm willing to walk through that door, to hear what others have to say, to get out of my own way, to allow my higher power to work through the structure, to work through others, to speak through my sponsor, so that I can truly turn my will over to this higher power as I understand him, her, or it. All right, shake your hands out. We've set the intention, and now we will go through the distractions that keep us from doing that, the possibility of our willingness to do that, and then the conviction to take that action, to actually move into the steps. All right, start on your first point. This is difficult. Next point. I don't know what turning it over means. I don't know what decision I have to make. I'm so used to running the show. I know I'm powerless. I know a power greater than me can restore me to sanity. But what does it mean to make a decision? What does that look like? How can I learn what exactly I need to do? I'm confused, and I'm afraid that I'll try to seize control again because it's my nature. But I do have the willingness. And I guess what I really need to do is show up, to admit I don't have the answers, to really, really surrender to the knowingness that the way that I was trying to run the show did not work. So I am willing to just get out of my own way, to suspend my doubt, my confusion, my need to know, and to let God speak through others, speak through the structure, and show me the way. I am willing to show up. I am willing to state the prayer on a daily basis, understanding that each day that I say that prayer, that I will come more and more in tune and in alignment with the true essence of what that means. But today, in this moment, I make the decision to turn my will to not be active. I turn that over to God so that by showing up, I can surrender and let God's work come through me. All right. As part of this tapping, I'm going to read to you the prayer for step 3 and just tap on the endpoints. And with each phrase, just move to the next one and take this in on the stage 1 level. God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help. Of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life, may I do thy will always. All right, take a deep breath. And then we are going to continue and progress into the tapping for step 3 in stage 2. So again, come to the karate. So even though in that fragmented stage, my inner child tried so desperately to run the show, and he or she tried to control everything within his or her environment in an attempt to feel safe and to heal. But I, as the illuminated adult, I am now ready to embody that adult space, the part of me who truly does believe and knows that God, as I understand that essence is truly in charge. And because I know this, I am able to surrender to the guidance of that higher energy, to be a conduit for my higher power, to bring the compassion I have felt in my day-to-day life into my relationship with that fragmented self, so that he or she can truly begin to heal. I am so willing to embrace the following 6-step plan of action that will truly assist my inner child in feeling safe, in learning how to trust me, that I can do for him or her what was not done in the past. By my willingness to step up on his or her behalf, the healing can truly come through. And together, the divinity can heal the fragmented part of me, can work with this severing of this vitality, and through me, Spirit can reach this inner child and invite him or her to trust. All right, so you see how we're making the decision to be a conduit for God's love on behalf of the inner child. And by getting out of our ego's way, we are allowing that compassion and that love to come through. So start on your first point. This need to control, this fear that my inner child has housed, the fragmented part of me who developed the false beliefs, the false self, the adapted self, so that I could survive. But I am now in touch with that power beyond me. And I am able to come into relationship with that younger self because I have made the decision to be present. I am willing to turn over that need to control on behalf of my inner child, so I can replace that with compassion and love. I am the go-between that connects this fragile self filled with so much shame, guilt, and fear. I can connect him or her to this higher self. And I am now willing to do that so that we can heal. All right, now I want to read this prayer again. And you're reading it from the eyes of the inner child, and you're reading it really to the inner child on behalf of the inner child. So listen to these words of the third step prayer. And the adult self is really saying to the maker, I'm willing to do this, and who we are serving is the inner child. God, keep tapping, by the way, on your endpoints. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will, so that I can better bring through that love to my inner child. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those within me I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. Now see, that has a real different feel when we're saying it on behalf of the inner child. And we're coming home to that part of self. So that is the tapping that will get you started for stage 2. So with stage 3, we're again dealing with that disparity between the human self and the soul. And you are making a decision to let those two merge in union. So come to the karate. So even though there has been this disparity between my human self and my soul, I am now willing to let my belief in that power greater than either of us, for that power to become the harmonizer, the elixir that enables this partnership to soar. So even though I often feel tension within me when I'm unable to follow my higher power lead, I have now come to realize that I do believe in the marriage between these two parts of me. And the officiant of this marriage is the essence of the universe itself. I willingly and with great reverence commit to the 6-step plan of action that will enable this union to take place. All right, shake your hands out. Now we'll come to the endpoints and we'll anchor this in. First point. This disparity, this polarity, duality between my human and higher selves. I am now ready to come into union with these polar parts of me so that that marriage can operate on behalf of the whole. I make a decision to revere what my human self must endure. I make a decision to feel connected to the higher vision of this journey. I willingly release my ego attachment to the judgment that one is better than the next. I dissolve the shame that I can feel when I am not quite living up to the vibration of my soul. I totally understand that I am a work in progress, and that this relationship between these two distinct vibrational frequencies are a path to my own divinity. And as I embody that God essence within me, I allow Spirit to guide me, to really be my GPS, so that my intuition can be trusted and I can turn my will over so that the action I take is Spirit infused instead of ego driven, where attachment runs the show. I detach from the outcome, but I willingly step forth and take the action that's required. I commit to this 6-step process that will clean up my past and open the door for Spirit to work through me, and for these two sides of my psyche to work in unison, and that this partnership enables me to redesign my value system. So I'm truly walking on this earth and viewing my life through the eyes of my soul. All right, so now let's read this prayer again and see what it looks like or feels like when we look at it through this union, through this marriage. All right, now this is actually being said to those halves within us, and when we are integrated, then we speak to the integration in others. That's what namaste means. I salute the God within you with the God from the God within me. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and that way of life. May I do thy will always. Now, when we're saying this from stage 3, we're saying it from that integration of the human self and the higher self. And it's that marriage that is allowing that to come through because we are embodying it. All right, so now let's move into the tapping for stage 4. Now remember, stage 4 is dealing with the multidimensionality of our beingness and of our addiction. And so we are willing to use step 3 to make a decision to expand to that higher level of consciousness and that ability to see things from those multiple dimensions. Come to the karate. Even though there has been a division in the multiple parts of my being, I have now come to believe that a power greater than me can restore this union, can repair these fragments, and deal with the imbalance in the parts of my brain so that new neural pathways can be built. So even though there has been a disempowerment in the history of my soul, the lineage of my soul, the fragments of my soul, and the wounds have traveled along this continuum of tension and fear, I have now made the decision to surrender to this power greater than who I am in this incarnation with this addictive behavior. And as I commit to the 6-step plan of action, that it will enable me to repair these fragments so that my soul in its entirety can heal. Those post-traumatic stress signals that are being cued from other times and places, that are getting triggered by the stress in everyday life, I am able to come into relationship with that higher essence, to connect with the collective unconsciousness of the world. And as I do this, I become part of the mandala of healing. And I made the decision to allow this energy to come through. All right, let's go to the endpoints. Now, obviously, in your own work, you're going to take this in a variety of different places. What I'm trying to do with this broadcast and with this tapping is to tickle your interest in exploring your own journey of recovery from these angles. And if you're interested in the tapping, then you'll explore it more. But this will get you started. So come to your first point. These multiple distractions that pull me away from God. I now see the purpose of my addictions. And I'm willing to follow those threads, to take me back to that place in the history of my soul where this energetic blueprint began. I am willing to see the soul story of my disconnection from God, from the light. And I am willing to heal on behalf of all of these parts. I am a multiple dimensional being, and I am now ready to heal in all dimensions of time and consciousness. I make the decision to turn my need to control this embodiment over to the higher wisdom of my soul and to the essence of the universe itself. I understand and make the decision and have the willingness to be guided by that higher being so that a true soul healing can occur. All right, so now let's see what this prayer sounds like when we read it from fourth stage recovery. God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Now remember, this is on behalf of your soul. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help, of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. Now, when we're thinking about the other aspects of our soul, it's like we're asking our Maker to allow us the essence of who we are in this lifetime, the part of us who has attained the spiritual wisdom to be able to go back in time. Just like the illuminated adult self goes back in time and brings to the inner child the parenting and the nurturing that the inner child needed. Well, when we're dealing with this level of soul healing, the person that we have become, the essence of our soul that we are vibrating to in this embodiment, we have now attained the spiritual frequency to pull that thread back to previous lifetimes when our soul was not as advanced. And so those fragments of our soul are suspended in time, and they continue to vibrate in those post-traumatic stress situations, which get cued and travel that course of time and infuse us with that post-traumatic stress signal in current time. This is when we're cleaning that up. It's when we are making the decision and have the belief that we can change our brain. And we have the belief that we can reprogram our DNA. And we can reconfigure the vibration and the frequency of our electromagnetic field so that change can be sustained and the evolution of our soul can be realized. So this is how step 3 emerges in each of these stages. Now, the last thing that I want to do before we close for today is I want to read the Serenity Prayer and really invite you to tap your way into this. Now, some of you will recognize this from my 30-day program where I do a tapping sequence and I teach you how to tap to the Serenity Prayer. But just tap with this. I want this on the recording for you. Start just on the endpoints. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And therein lies the essence of step 3. Now, let's do a round with the short version. Again, just tap on the endpoints and just repeat after me. God's love resolves this situation here and now. God's love resolves this situation here and now. God's love resolves this tension here and now. God's love resolves this situation here and now. God's wisdom resolves this situation here and now. The universal force resolves this situation here and now. I turn this over to God's love because God's love can resolve this now. And that is a way to put into action step 3, no matter what stage you're dealing with. The tapping through that gets you out of that knee-jerk reaction to try to take control. So I hope this has been helpful. If anything has been triggered for you that inspires you to get a hold of me, please take advantage of that 15-minute free assessment that I offer. Just call me at 612-710-7720. And also, feel free to visit my website, which is www.eftforyourinnerchild.com. So without further ado, until next time, be good to you and to those you love. Thanks.
Thank you for tuning into EFT for Your Inner Child with best-selling author Cathryn Taylor on EFT Radio Online. You can listen live right here every other week, and you can also find information on Cathryn's programs and services, which feature her innovative tapping technique, by logging on to www.eftforyourinnerchild.com.